In the winter into spring stretch of 1941, there were mornings in southern England when the cold felt like it had teeth. It clung to the grass around dispersal pens, turned breath into smoke inside hangars, and crept into the joints of men who had slept too little and worked too long. At a fighter station, the day began the same way it always did. Boots on gravel, mugs of tea that never stayed hot, a ground crewman swearing at a stubborn latch, a pilot making a joke that wasn't funny because the joke was really a shield. If you stood on the edge of the tarmac and listened, you could hear two wars at once, the obvious one in the sky and the quiet one underneath it. The war of fatigue, attrition, and small mechanical failures that killed just as efficiently as bullets. A Merlin engine starting up sounded like confidence, a hard, metallic roar that shook your ribs and promised that this time, at least, the machine would do its part. But by 1941, there was a particular kind of dread that could creep in, even when the engine sounded perfect. Because men had learned, through experience, through funerals, through the strange, numb arithmetic of who didn't come back, that an engine could betray you without being hit, without smoke, without fire, without anything dramatic at all. All it needed was one wrong moment of gravity. You don't understand what that means until you imagine yourself in a cockpit at 15,000 feet, with the world turning into geometry and speed, and you push the nose down to attack. For a heartbeat, the aircraft goes light. Your body lifts against the harness. Your stomach floats. The horizon flips in a way your inner ear hates. In that heartbeat, the fuel in the carburetor doesn't behave like fuel is supposed to behave. It behaves like a liquid freed from the rule you were counting on. It surges where it shouldn't, and the careful balance of air and fuel, something that looks so tidy in a manual, becomes chaos. The engine coughs. The note changes. A second ago, you were a hunter. Now your aircraft is a glider with delusions. Your hands do what they've been trained to do: throttle, mixture, posture, breath. While your brain does something older and simpler, it starts to count time. 1 second, 1.5, 2. In air combat, that's not a delay. That's an eternity. That's enough for an enemy fighter to close the distance and put rounds where you can't afford them. That's enough to lose the angle, lose the kill, lose the escape route. That's enough to die without ever seeing the man who killed you. Because the man who killed you was a design flaw and a law of physics holding hands. The phrase the RAF used for it, engine cutout, was so clean it felt obscene. It was as if the language itself was trying to tidy up something too ugly to say plainly. Your engine stops when you dive, and the enemy knows it. It wasn't just a technical nuisance. It was a tactical wound that bled confidence. German pilots in fast fighters could push over and keep their power. British pilots often had to choose between the perfect pursuit and the safe pursuit, between the clean attack line and the awkward workaround. Roll inverted, then pull through so gravity stayed positive and the carburetor didn't choke. That workaround saved engines, but it cost time. It added motion to what should have been instinct, and in dog fights, extra motion is another word for missed opportunities. You can feel the cruelty of it. You spot the enemy, and your body is ready, your eyes are ready, your hands are ready, but your aircraft is not. It tells you, in the quietest way possible, that it will not follow you into the maneuver you need most. It turns aggression into caution. It turns pursuit into hesitation. And hesitation in war is often paid for in blood. The brutality of 1940 had already taught fighter command what it meant to lose people faster than you could replace them. The summer and autumn of the Battle of Britain weren't a single epic moment. They were a relentless grind of raids, scrambles, damaged aircraft that were repaired and sent back up. Young men who learned fear on Monday and were buried by Friday. RAF stations like Kenley and Biggin Hill became names that carried a particular weight because the enemy didn't only try to shoot fighters out of the sky, they tried to erase the fighters on the ground, to crater the runways, burn the hangars, and turn the entire airfield into a graveyard of metal and smoke. When bombers came in low enough, you could hear the scream of falling bombs like a sound that belonged in nightmares, and then the world became shaking earth, splintering concrete, sheets of flame rolling out of hangars, and men running with extinguishers that looked laughably small against the fire. Even when the Battle of Britain's most famous phase ended, the war didn't stop. The Channel remained a short strip of water, and on the other side, the enemy still existed, still probed, still raided, still hunted. The air war became less visible in headlines and more visible in the hollow faces of people who lived on stations where the sky could demand payment at any hour. In that world, a momentary cut wasn't momentary at all. It was a recurring ghost. It showed up in combat reports and maintenance logs like a bad omen repeated. Pilots described the same sickening sensation: push into a sudden dive, feel the aircraft go light, hear the Merlin stumble, watch the enemy slip away. Or worse, watch the enemy turn back and punish you while you fought the engine instead of fighting the man. Ground crew heard the stories and then went back to tightening bolts and checking fuel lines because there was nothing else to do. The war demanded motion. It demanded that grief be folded into routine. The cruelty of this kind of conflict is that it becomes normal to lose friends. It becomes normal to see an empty bunk and not ask questions. It becomes normal to treat death as a scheduling problem. We're short 2 pilots. We need replacements. The aircraft are ready. We fly anyway. Somewhere, in early 1941, far from the sound of engines at dispersal pens, another kind of pressure was building in a different place, at Farnborough, inside the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where the war was fought in data and metal in the relentless pursuit of solutions that had to be both clever and fast. This was not a battlefield most people imagined when they pictured World War II. There were no dog fights above the laboratories, no tracer arcs through the hallways, no flak bursts in the clouds over the test rigs. But the stakes were no less real. The people there understood a terrible truth. A mistake made in a quiet room could kill a man loudly at 20,000 feet. They read reports, not as stories, but as diagnostics. They studied failures as if failures were speaking a language. And among those engineers was Beatrice Shilling, an engineer with the kind of mind that couldn't ignore a problem simply because it was politically inconvenient or bureaucratically slow. She had the instincts of a mechanic and the discipline of a scientist. She understood engines in a way that went beyond diagrams. She understood them the way riders understand a motorcycle at speed, the way you learn to feel vibration through your hands before a gauge ever admits something is wrong. She had grown up with machines, taken them apart, put them back together, and learned the intimate truth that machines are honest. They fail according to rules, not according to excuses. Before the war, she had loved speed, motorcycles, racing, the sensation of mechanical strain translated into movement. That experience didn't make her reckless. It made her precise. Racing teaches you that tolerances matter, that stress reveals weaknesses, that a tiny error at low speed becomes catastrophic at high speed. War is the highest speed environment imaginable. Now she was facing a wartime problem that was brutally simple. Under -G, the carburetor's float chamber behaved badly. Fuel flooded where it shouldn't, and the Merlin stumbled at the worst possible moment. The reports said it again and again. The pattern was clear. The consequences were lethal. It wasn't a mystery. It was a known flaw turning into a body count. Engineers at Rolls-Royce and elsewhere were working on proper, long-term solutions. Pressure-fed systems, redesigned carburation, more fundamental changes that would make the fuel delivery insensitive to gravity's direction. But those solutions were heavy and slow. They required manufacturing shifts, testing schedules, approval chains, and time. Time was exactly what Fighter Command didn't have. The war didn't care that a redesign would be ready next year. The war cared about this week's patrol, today's scramble, the next moment a pilot pushed his nose down and needed power. And this is where a different kind of courage enters the story, because courage is not only found in cockpits. There is also courage in refusing to wait while people die from something you can fix. Tilly Shilling began to think like a wartime engineer, which means she stopped asking, "What is the ideal solution?" and started asking, "What can we do now, safely enough, at scale, without grounding the entire force?" That shift matters, because it's the difference between elegant design and survival. The simplest way to explain her insight is to picture a flood and a dam. If fuel surges uncontrollably during -G, then don't allow it to surge uncontrollably. Restrict the flow, not completely, because engines need fuel, but enough to prevent the worst flooding effect during the brief period when gravity is reversed. It was a brutal piece of simplicity, a choke point, a controlled bottleneck, a small, precisely sized orifice that would limit the maximum fuel flow through the line feeding the carburetor, making the system less likely to drown itself in that vulnerable moment. In a lab, it looked absurdly humble. Not a glamorous invention, not a new engine, not a redesigned carburetor. Just a small brass component you could hold between fingers, the kind of thing that could disappear into a toolbox and be forgotten. But in engineering, humble doesn't mean unimportant. Humble often means it's likely to work. The problem, as always, was in the details. The hole size had to be right, because too large and the problem remained. Too small and you could starve the engine at full throttle, trading one lethal failure for another. So Shilling and her team iterated. They tested different sizes, different shapes, watched engine behavior under simulated conditions, measured flows, listened to how the engine responded when it was pushed. Bench tests suggested they had it. Under conditions meant to mimic -G, the engine held on rather than falling silent. But bench tests do not have a man inside the machine. Bench tests don't have an enemy turning in behind you. Bench tests don't have the smell of fear in the cockpit. That was the gap between laboratory confidence and wartime reality. And closing that gap meant doing something risky. Because to prove a solution in war, eventually you must put it into an operational aircraft and let it face the world. That is not a technical decision alone. That is a moral decision. It means accepting responsibility for the consequences. It means knowing that if it fails, you won't just be wrong. You will have helped kill someone. It also means knowing that if you don't act, the status quo will keep killing people anyway, slowly and reliably, while everyone hides behind regulations. Wartime bureaucracy has a strange relationship with responsibility. It can spread it so thin that no one feels it, even as bodies accumulate. Shilling didn't have the luxury of that kind of diffusion. She cared too much. And she understood too clearly that delay was its own form of violence. So she took her small brass restrictors out of the lab and into the world of fighter stations where world meant mud, fuel, fatigue, and the constant possibility of sudden death. She arrived not with a grand announcement, but with a satchel and a plan. In some retellings, she's on a motorcycle, because she really was that kind of person, because she liked machines and speed, because riding cleared her mind, because wartime Britain was full of long drives on narrow roads, and she didn't have patience to sit still. However she arrived, the essential truth is the same. She brought something small into a place where everything was life and death large. On a station, the ground crew understood instantly why she was there. You don't have to explain -G cutout to men who have watched pilots limp home, white-faced, or watched them not come home at all. Ground crew live in the shadow of the air war. They see the holes in wings. They smell burned glycol. They listen to pilots' voices after a mission and hear the forced calm that means, "I nearly died." They also know how war really works, not as a drama, but as logistics. If Shilling's fix required grounding aircraft for days, it would be rejected no matter how brilliant it was, because operational reality would crush it. But her restrictor could be installed quickly. That mattered. The installation itself was almost anticlimactic, which is what made it extraordinary. Disconnect a fuel line. Insert the brass piece. Seal it properly. Check for leaks. Make sure the weld or fitting is solid, because a sloppy job could starve an engine completely and kill a pilot faster than the original problem. That is why Shilling didn't just design a part. She obsessed over how it would be installed by tired men under pressure, in bad weather, with engines that needed to fly again in hours, not days. War is not kind to delicate solutions. War rewards anything that works under abuse. Her restrictor was an abuse-friendly idea. Simple, cheap, fast. There was still risk. There was always risk. Installing an unapproved modification on a frontline fighter could be a career-ending offense, and if the modification contributed to a crash, the consequences could be severe. But in the field, a different law existed, the law of survival. Squadron leaders and pilots might complain about paperwork in peacetime. In wartime, they cared about coming home. A part that reduced the chance of an engine cutting out in a dive wasn't just a technical improvement. It was a psychological one. It gave pilots back a sliver of trust in their aircraft. And trust is a weapon. A pilot who trusts his engine presses a tax that a fearful pilot breaks off. A pilot who presses a tax gets kills that a cautious pilot misses. Over weeks and months, those small changes accumulate into larger patterns. More aggressive tactics, more successful pursuits, fewer lost opportunities, fewer deaths caused by momentary helplessness. The first time a pilot pushed over into a hard dive after the restrictor was installed, he did it with a kind of superstition. He expected the cough. He expected the sick silence. He probably braced for it without even thinking, the way you brace for pain you felt before. And when the Merlin kept running, when the engine didn't stumble, when power held through the dive, the sensation would have been almost shocking. Not because it made him invincible, but because it removed a known betrayal. It would feel as if the aircraft was finally fighting with him rather than against him. He could commit to the dive instead of performing the awkward half-roll workaround. He could close the distance. He could get into firing range before the enemy recognized the threat. In those few seconds, it might be the difference between a burst of machine gun fire that tore into an enemy wing and an enemy that simply slid away untouched. Pilots came back and talked, and word traveled through the RAF in the way word always travels through human networks under stress. Faster than official orders, faster than memos, faster than any proper chain of command. Mechanics told mechanics. A sergeant phoned a friend at another station. A pilot demanded to know what had been done to his engine because it felt different. And when he was told, he didn't ask for authorization. He asked how fast it could be done to every aircraft on the line. You could almost see how a small idea became a movement. On some stations, men might have argued in a room about whether it should be allowed. Outside, ground crew were already installing it because they were tired of watching people die from a known flaw. This is the secret history of wartime innovation. It often begins as a rumor and spreads as a necessity. The bureaucratic world eventually catches up and stamps approved on what reality already adopted. But the early phase is messy and human and risky. It is carried by the conviction that if you wait for perfect procedure, you will bury more friends. Within weeks, in many places, the brass restrictor became common enough that it gained a nickname. One of those crude, unforgettable pieces of RAF humor that reveals the psychological atmosphere better than any official document. They called it Miss Shilling's orifice. In another environment, the nickname might have been disrespectful. In a fighter station at war, it was a kind of affection, a way of turning a life-saving detail into something that could be easily remembered, easily requested, easily talked about without fear. Men at war often survive by joking at the edge of horror. If you can laugh at something, you can say it out loud. If you can say it out loud, you can spread it. And spreading it meant more aircraft with fewer cutouts, more pilots with fewer moments of helplessness. That didn't make combat safe. It didn't make the sky kind. It simply removed one specific trap that had been killing people unfairly. And unfairly is an important word here. War is unfair by nature, but there is a particular kind of unfairness when a pilot dies because his aircraft can't do something the enemy's aircraft can do. Not because of skill or courage, but because of a technical quirk. Removing that quirk doesn't remove the horror of dogfights. Dogfights remained violent, chaotic, terrifying. Pilots still died in flames. Aircraft still broke apart. Men still vanished into the sea. But it changed a small piece of the tactical landscape. It changed how pilots behaved. It changed what they dared. In combat psychology, that matters. One of the ugliest truths about fighter warfare is that experience becomes more valuable than equipment, and experience is bought with survival. A pilot who survives 20 combats becomes dangerous in a way a newly trained pilot isn't. He learns to read angles. He learns to sense traps. He learns to anticipate. If a mechanical flaw kills experienced pilots, it doesn't just kill individuals. It drains the entire force of accumulated skill. So a modification that helps pilots survive, even slightly, can have ripple effects beyond the immediate number of engine cutouts. It can preserve experience. It can preserve morale. It can preserve the instinct to fight aggressively rather than defensively. And those things are hard to measure on paper but obvious in outcome. You can imagine the change at the squadron level. Fewer stories of engines coughing at the wrong moment. Fewer pilots limping home, swearing at their carburetors. Fewer empty chairs that used to belong to the men everyone relied on. Even the ground crew would feel it. They would still work until their hands ached. Still sleep in brief segments. Still repair aircraft under pressure. But one particular dread would ease. The dread that the aircraft was doomed by design. It is hard to describe how it feels to work around a killing flaw day after day. It wears you down in a quiet way. So when the restrictor spread, it wasn't just pilots who benefited. It was the people who supported them. It gave ground crews a sense that their work could actually change outcomes, not just clean up after disaster. It gave them a victory that didn't come with medals, but came with fewer funerals. Now, in a long war, no victory stays pure. The restrictor was never a perfect cure. It was a stopgap, a tourniquet, a practical compromise. It reduced the worst behavior under brief negative G conditions. It did not magically let carburetor-equipped fighters fly inverted indefinitely without consequence. The proper, long-term solution was pressure-fed fuel delivery and improved carburation that was insensitive to gravity direction, and that was coming later. By 1943, more advanced systems were entering service, and the negative G problem could be addressed more thoroughly. But war is not a clean laboratory. Aircraft are not replaced overnight. Upgrades are not installed everywhere at once. Many crews and stations kept what worked, trusted what they knew, and relied on the restrictor for far longer than any engineer would have planned in peacetime. War creates loyalty to proven fixes because changing anything introduces risk. If a brass washer has kept engines running through dives, some pilots would rather keep it than trade it for an untested, better system, even if that better system is objectively superior. That's not irrational. That's survival logic. And Shilling understood that too. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was chasing reliability. She moved on to other problems because the war kept producing them. Cold weather starting issues that could strand aircraft uselessly in freezing climates. Fuel mixture problems at high altitude where thin air made engines temperamental. Icing, vapor lock, minor issues that became lethal at 30,000 feet. In wartime engineering, there is no final problem solved, only a constant triage of what kills people next. That is a grim kind of work because it means your job is defined by the ways humans die. You spend your days trying to block those paths one by one, knowing you'll never block them all. And still you try, because each blocked path is a handful of lives saved, and that matters, even if it doesn't end the war. There's another layer to Shilling's story that is easy to romanticize and just as easy to overlook. The social atmosphere. Being a woman in that engineering environment was not a footnote. It was part of the pressure. Many men in that era, even well-educated men, still carried the assumption that women did not belong in technical roles. Some would have dismissed her automatically. Some would have smiled politely and assumed she was an assistant. Some would have resented her competence. The war did not erase those biases. It sometimes intensified them because stress makes people cling to old hierarchies. Shilling didn't have the luxury of taking those attitudes personally. She had pilots dying. She had engines failing. She had a problem that required focus. In a way, that cold, practical focus became her armor. She could outthink a carburetor. She could outwork a committee. She could endure being underestimated if it meant buying time for people who were being burned alive in cockpits. That's an ugly trade-off to be forced into, but war forces ugly trades on everyone. It asks young men to trade youth for fear. It asks ground crew to trade sleep for routine. It asks engineers to trade perfect solutions for immediate ones. And it asks people like Shilling to trade approval for action. The cost of her choice was not only professional risk, it was emotional risk. Because if you install a modification and a pilot dies, the death doesn't become "war happened." The death becomes personal. It becomes the thing that haunts you on quiet nights when the war's noise fades enough for your mind to speak. This is what makes her decision something more than clever. Clever is easy in hindsight. Courage is not. Courage is doing something when you know it could ruin you, and you do it anyway because the alternative ruins others. Imagine her standing on a tarmac watching aircraft take off with her fix installed, knowing that the only true test is combat. Combat is not a controlled environment. Combat is 300 miles an hour, sweat in your eyes, and a man trying to kill you. Combat is negative G strong enough to lift you against the straps that are meant to hold you in the seat. Combat is the moment a pilot pushes into a dive that previously triggered failure, and this time the engine must not fail, because if it does, he may not come back. There is a special kind of helplessness in that waiting. Not the helplessness of a pilot in a stalled dive, but the helplessness of an engineer who has done everything she can, and now must watch. You can calculate flows. You can test on benches. You can specify tolerances. But you cannot fly the mission for the pilot. You cannot pull the trigger for him. You can only give him a machine that has a better chance of doing its job. That's all. And all is still everything. The war in the sky remained savage. Dogfights were still close enough to see the other pilot's canopy flash in the sun. Fighters still broke apart into pieces that fell like burning leaves. Men still drowned in the channel, trapped by parachutes, weighed down by gear, swallowed by cold water faster than they could fight it. Some pilots died without ever being hit because they pushed their aircraft too hard, because fatigue made a small mistake feel invisible until it became fatal. And yet, removing one preventable failure mode matters because war already has too many ways to kill you. This story is about subtracting one of them. It's about the grim logic of survival. You don't need perfection to live. You need fewer disasters. A brass restrictor didn't win the war by itself. It did something subtler. It gave pilots back a little time. It gave them back a little confidence. It gave them back the ability to commit to attacks without the private fear that the engine would go silent at the worst moment. Over the long grind of 1941 and beyond, that kind of change can shape outcomes in ways historians argue about and pilots simply feel. It can change whether a pursuit ends in a kill or an escape. It can change whether a German pilot's favorite trick still works. It can change whether an RAF pilot survives long enough to teach the next wave of recruits how to live. And that's the aspect people miss when they reduce it to a fun engineering anecdote. This isn't a cute story about a washer. This is a story about a war that made a washer into a life-saving weapon. It's a story about how brutality forces ingenuity to become urgent, and how urgency forces people to do things they would never do in peacetime. It is also a reminder that the war was not only fought by those who flew and shot. It was fought by those who read the reports and refused to accept them as inevitable. The most haunting thing about the negative G cutout isn't the physics. It's the way it turned bravery into vulnerability. A pilot does the aggressive, correct combat move, push over to attack, and the aircraft punishes him for it. That is psychologically corrosive. You can't ask a man to be aggressive if the machine slaps his hand every time he tries. You can train him to work around it, yes. You can teach him the half-roll trick, but you cannot erase the feeling that something inside the aircraft is waiting to betray him. Removing that feeling matters as much as removing the failure itself. When pilots began to trust their Merlins in dives again, even partially, it likely shifted their posture in the air. The war is full of tiny posture changes that become huge in aggregate. A pilot commits a second earlier, fires a fraction longer, holds pursuit a little deeper, breaks off a little later. Those tiny decisions decide who goes home, and on the ground, the effect is just as human. A mechanic seeing fewer aircraft come back with stories of engine died in the dive feels a small, fierce relief. It means he didn't spend 12 hours sweating over a machine only for it to betray someone in a way he couldn't prevent. It means his work actually mattered beyond maintenance. It means there is a sense, rare in war, that the situation improved, that the horror didn't only deepen. That kind of morale is a resource too, and it's often forgotten. People speak about morale as if it's propaganda posters and speeches, but real morale is quieter. It's the belief that tomorrow might be slightly less hopeless than yesterday. Shilling's restrictor gave people a reason to believe that, at least in one narrow slice of the problem. The irony is that the better a fix works, the less visible it becomes. Nobody writes poems about an engine that does not fail. Nobody remembers the day a pilot dove and the engine kept running. Because in a perfect world, that would be normal. But in 1941, it wasn't. In 1941, normal was a sequence of emergencies, and the absence of one emergency was a miracle. That's why the restrictor became famous in its own strange way. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was the kind of fix fighter command desperately needed. Quick, simple, effective, scalable. It could be made in quantity. It could be installed without grounding squadrons. It could be explained in a few sentences, and it addressed a tactical disadvantage that pilots felt in their bones every time they had to break off an attack. When the long-term pressure systems arrived later, the restrictor's role changed, but its lesson did not. The lesson was that in wartime, you sometimes win not by inventing something enormous, but by identifying the smallest lever that shifts the outcome and pulling it hard. That lever was a tiny hole in brass, a controlled restriction in fuel flow, the sort of thing a bored mechanic might toss aside if he didn't know its purpose. Yet in that war, its purpose was as sharp as a bullet. Keep the engine alive in the moment that decides life or death. And the person who brought that lever to the stations wasn't a charismatic commander on a poster. She was an engineer with grease on her hands and stubbornness in her spine, walking into a culture that didn't always want her there, and doing it anyway, because she had read too many reports that ended in the same cold phrases. It's tempting to make this into a clean moral fable. Brilliant woman, simple solution, war saved, applause. The reality is messier, which is why it's worth telling. The war remained terrifying. People still died in horrible ways. The sky remained indifferent, but one particular avoidable death became less likely, and that mattered in a world where so much death was unavoidable. If you want to understand the difference between peacetime engineering and wartime engineering, it is this. Peacetime engineering strives for optimization. Wartime engineering strives for survival. Optimization asks, how can we make it best? Survival asks, how can we make it not kill someone today? Shilling's restrictor was survival engineering. It was a tourniquet on a bleeding floor. It bought time until the proper cure arrived. And time is the only resource war never gives back. Every day you buy is a day someone might survive. Every month you buy is a month a pilot might become experienced enough to survive the next fight. Every season you buy is a season more people might go home instead of being reduced to names on a list and a grim story told in a quiet mess hall. So when you imagine the air war over the Channel in 1941, don't only imagine the dogfights, the spirals, the tracers, the sudden flames. Also imagine the small hidden changes that made those fights slightly less unfair. Imagine a fuel line with a brass piece inserted in it. Imagine a mechanic's careful weld. Imagine an engineer checking the fit, not because she wants credit, but because she knows a bad joint could kill a stranger. Imagine a pilot pushing into a dive and not hearing the cough. That's the kind of victory that doesn't look like victory until you've lived the alternative. And if you're listening to this and thinking, it's just a washer, then you're already close to the point. In war, just doesn't exist. The war turns ordinary objects into extraordinary consequences. A washer becomes a weapon. A hole becomes an advantage. A minute becomes a lifetime. And a person who refuses to wait becomes the difference between a pilot dying in a silent dive and a pilot coming home to land on a battered runway and climb out, shaking, alive, with the bitter gratitude of someone who knows he survived, not because the war was kind, but because someone on the ground made it a little less cruel. If this kind of story is why you watch, stories where the turning point isn't a super weapon but a human choice under pressure, then take a second right now to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks history is only decided by generals and aces. It helps this channel keep doing long-form documentaries that go deeper than the usual headlines, because the forgotten front lines are often the most human ones. Now, as the months roll forward and new systems slowly arrive, the restrictor remains in place in countless aircraft. It becomes part of the background of the war, a silent companion to pilots who will never meet the person who made it. That's another grim truth. Most lives saved by good engineering never know they were saved. They simply survive a moment they might not have. They come home exhausted. They light a cigarette with hands that shake. They laugh too loudly in the mess. They write a letter that sounds casual and hides terror between the lines. And somewhere, the engineer returns to her next problem because war is a machine that constantly produces new ways to die. Cold weather, high altitude, fuel icing, mixture instability. Each one a threat, each one a potential list of names if left unattended. She keeps working, not because she is fearless, but because she is unwilling to accept preventable death as normal. That is, in its own quiet way, a kind of defiance. And when the war eventually ends, when the headlines finally do match reality and people begin to pack away uniforms and pretend normal life can be rebuilt, the small brass washer will sit in memory as a symbol. Some will remember it as a clever trick. Some will remember it as a crude joke in a nickname. But the most honest way to remember it is this. It was a response to horror. It was a response to the sight of young men climbing into aircraft, knowing their own engines might betray them. It was a refusal to let bureaucracy move at peacetime speed while wartime death moved at combat speed. It was a reminder that in the most brutal years of the 20th century, survival sometimes depended on solutions so small you could hide them in a hand, and on the stubborn people who insisted those solutions be used before it was too late. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, do me one more favor. Leave a comment with the next WWII subject you want. An aircraft, a battle, a strange invention, an overlooked unit, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next film. This channel exists to pull these stories out of the shadows and put them back where they belong, in the light of memory. Because the past isn't only made of the loud moments. It's also made of quiet decisions, like an engineer carrying a piece of brass to an airfield and a pilot diving into danger, and an engine that, this time, does not go silent.